Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something really critical. We're taking a necessary and I think rigorous look at one of the most, well, fraught, maybe revolutionary periods in American history, Reconstruction.
Yeah.
This wasn't just some political footnote after the Civil War, was it? It feels like a total societal upheaval.
Oh, absolutely. A complete transformation.
Yeah.
And we're anchoring this deep dive specifically in South Carolina.
Right, the flashpoint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The place where secession kicked off, the state most fundamentally built on the plantation economy. It experienced this upheaval with, well, brutal intensity.
How bad was it by 65?
The state was left absolutely devastated, physically, economically, socially.
Just gutted.
And our sources today, they let us hold these two, like, completely different experiences side by side, don't they?
They do. It's quite powerful. On one side, we're tracking the white planter class families like the DuBois you mentioned.
They had to scramble, basically, to rebuild their lives, their wealth, their whole identity in a world where suddenly they had very little power and often a lot of debt.
A world turned upside down for them.
Completely. And then on the other side, we're looking at the dawn of freedom, what was called the Jubilee, for the hundreds of thousands of African Americans who had been enslaved by these very same families.
Wow.
So our mission, really, is to get beyond just the summary of Reconstruction. We want to understand how both groups, the former masters and the newly freed, navigated this completely altered, unprecedented reality. How do they actually live through it?
Okay, let's unpack this. We really have to start with the planter class, I think.
Agreed.
Because the story of their loss, it kind of defines the starting conditions for Reconstruction, doesn't it?
It really does. It sets the immediate context.
So imagine that Confederate soldier. He's coming back to his family's land, maybe in the Low Country, spring or summer of 1865. We often focus on the physical destruction, the burned buildings and fields. But what was the immediate structural reality he faced? What did he actually find?
The word for it is obliteration. Just complete obliteration of his world.
Obliteration. That's strong.
It fits.
Yeah.
He returned to find a society where the foundation of everything he knew hadn't just cracked, it had been structurally nullified. Gone.
Meaning the economy.
Meaning the plantation economy, yes. Which was essentially a machine optimized purely for extracting wealth through forced labor. That machine was dead.
Yeah.
It just stopped functioning the moment federal troops arrived and emancipation was enforced.
And what about the money? We hear, the South was financially ruined. What did that actually mean in practical terms for a family like the DuBois?
It meant instant, total bankruptcy for many. I mean, the wealth of these large planter families, it wasn't sitting in, gold bars or U.S. federal banks.
Right.
It was tied up in two main things. Land, obviously, and human chattel, the enslaved people themselves.
Oh.
And second, whatever liquid capital they did have bonds, war notes, actual currency, it was Confederate.
Which became worthless.
Instantly. Legally worthless the moment the Union won. It was literally just paper. So multi-generational fortunes built up over decades, poof, gone overnight, zeroed out.
So their savings just vanished, but you said the biggest asset wasn't even the cash, it was the people they enslaved.
Correct.
So how devastating was that loss, viewing it purely through their economic lens, their identity?
It was catastrophic.
Yeah.
Absolutely catastrophic. For a planter, the enslaved people were assets. They were the central investment of the entire operation.
Like machinery or stock today.
In their view, yes, but vastly more significant. When emancipation came, that asset base, which for many planters represented the single largest chunk of their total net worth, was just gone, wiped off the books.
So it wasn't just a labor shortage.
Oh, much more than that. It was a fundamental identity crisis. Their social status, their political power, their very sense of self was all built on owning and controlling other human beings. That sudden loss stripped them bare. It challenged everything they thought they were.
We have some primary sources, don't we, that really capture this profound disorientation. They seem essential for getting inside their heads.
They certainly are. Invaluable, really.
Yeah.
If you look at the two diaries from Middle St. John's, Berkeley, they offer this vivid window into the mind of the white elite right at that moment.
What do they say?
Well, Susan Jervey's entry from May 1865, it's chilling, really, in its despair.
Yeah.
She wrote about the sudden, undeniable confrontation with their new reality. Her words were, poverty, staring us in the face.
Staring us in the face. That suggests it wasn't a slow decline, but a sudden shock, a terrifying realization that their whole social position was just gone.
Exactly. That suddenness is key. And her language reveals more about their sense of self, their psychology.
Like,
It reveals the immediate trauma of defeat. She talked about the sad, sad subjugation of our country. For her, this wasn't just losing a political fight.
No.
It was the psychological weight of being conquered. And crucially, being governed by forces they saw as inferior, federal troops, and later newly freed African Americans casting votes.
Right.
And maybe the most telling phrase she uses is her feeling of being strangers in our own land.
Strangers in their own land. That's a powerful image.
Isn't it?
To feel like an outsider on the very land you previously commanded with absolute authority, that sense of status reversal must have been incredibly sharp. Painful.
Extremely severe. They felt politically invalidated, socially displaced, even while physically standing on their own property. Their world was inverted.
So their entire framework for understanding society, their racial hierarchy, their economic dominance, social privilege, it was just shattered.
Right.
Overturned by federal law and military occupation.
Precisely. And this internal narrative they developed of victimhood, of being strangers, it's crucial. Because that feeling, that resentment, it forms the emotional bedrock for the resistance that's going to define the next decade.
Okay, so this is where the narrative just pivots dramatically, doesn't
A
it?
complete 180.
Because that exact moment of despair, financial ruin, and status loss for the planter, that was the moment of, well, transcendent, overwhelming, life-altering joy for the formerly enslaved people.
Yes, the Jubilee.
Let's shift there now. Let's talk about the experience of the African-American population.
The Jubilee. It was the moment of absolute truth, of answered prayers for generations. And to understand this moment, we rely heavily on sources like the WPA slave narratives.
Can you remind us what those are?
Sure. So during the 1930s, under the New Deal, the Federal Writers Project, part of the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, sent interviewers out across the South. They collected thousands of firsthand accounts from elderly individuals who had actually lived through slavery and experienced the moment of freedom. These narratives preserve that crucial, immediate memory. It's an incredible resource.
And what do those memories tell us about how freedom actually arrived? Was it chaos? Was it confusion? Or something else?
There was certainly uncertainty, but the overwhelming feeling captured in the narratives is pure, unadulterated relief. And this profound realization that things had fundamentally changed.
How do they describe it?
One interviewee remembered the community reaction when the news finally came, often brought by Union soldiers marching through. He said, they was praying for it. When the news come, some was singing, some was shouting. It was the Jubilee.
The Jubilee, you can almost hear it.
You can. And the profundity isn't just in the celebration, right? It's in the immediate, tangible gain.
Yeah.
Legal control over their own bodies, their own futures. For the very first time, the transition from being property, like livestock, to being a person with rights, it was absolute.
Okay, so the news arrives, the Jubilee happens. When that initial wave settles, and the immediate threat of being dragged back to the plantation maybe lessens a bit, what was the very first thing people did? What was the absolute top priority of freedom?
The foundational act, overwhelmingly, was family reunification. And this wasn't just, an emotional reunion, though of course it was that too. It was a strategic, complex undertaking.
Why strategic?
Because slavery was designed to destroy black families. It was migratory, it was destructive to kinship ties, spouses, children, parents. They were deliberately sold away, often across state lines, to maximize profit for the enslaver. Family bonds were seen as inconvenient.
So freedom meant immediately trying to reverse that deliberate destruction.
Precisely. People walked hundreds, sometimes literally thousands of miles. They relied on informal networks of other newly freed people, maybe got help from organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau, just to find a spouse, a child, a parent sold away years before.
Wow. Just walk.
Just walking, asking, searching. This was an act of profound self-determination. They had to navigate a landscape that was physically devastated, deal with uncertain legal status, face hostility. But restoring those sacred family bonds was their first, most powerful declaration of independence. It was about building a legal, stable foundation for the future.
And once they tried to secure that immediate family unit, what came next? There seems to be a second priority that sounds symbolic but actually carried immense legal weight.
Absolutely. That would be choosing a surname, a family name.
Why was that so important?
Under slavery, identities were intentionally fragmented. You were often known only by a first name Mary, John, or maybe implicitly by the name of the white family who claimed ownership to boast as John.
Right.
Choosing a surname, a formal public declaration of a family name, was a powerful act of claiming individuality, of claiming independence. It meant saying, I am not merely chattel belonging to the DuBose family. I am Mr. Jones, or Mrs. Williams or Mr. Washington. I am an autonomous legal person.
And that was necessary for practical things, too.
Essential. Absolutely essential for everything that needed to follow. Owning property, registering to vote eventually, getting legally married, signing contracts. It established you as a distinct entity in the eyes of the law and the community.
So they're reuniting families, claiming names, building a new identity. But to support this new autonomous life, they couldn't really rely on the existing white structures, could they?
Generally, no. Not safely or reliably.
So where did they channel that incredible organizational energy that must have been unleashed?
They channeled it immediately into building their own institutions, independent of white control. And priority number 3, arguably the most important institution, was the independent African-American church.
The church.
Yes, these churches were absolutely critical. They sprang up everywhere, sometimes starting under brush arbors, sometimes taking over abandoned buildings. They immediately became the absolute center of the new community structure.
More than just places for Sunday worship.
Oh, far more. They were the organizational hubs. They provided mutual aid, helping the sick, burying the dead.
Yeah.
They often acted as informal courts to settle disputes. They housed the first schools for black children, often taught by literate members of the congregation or northern missionaries.
Politically.
Critically important politically. They served as the political meeting places where leaders could organize voters, discuss legislative issues coming out of the State House, and plan community action. The black church was the center of gravity for the community.
So the church provided the sort of structural continuity and leadership needed to navigate the immense challenges that were coming,
Exactly.
especially economic challenges.
Yeah.
Which brings us, I guess, to the really messy middle of Reconstruction.
Right.
The economy.
Right.
We have this fundamental imbalance, right? Planters have huge amounts of land,
Yep.
but no cash and no legally forced labor anymore.
Right. Land rich, cash poor.
And the freedmen, they have their labor, they have skills learned over generations, but they have no land and almost no capital.
A complete mismatch. And this created a situation where some kind of new arrangement was absolutely necessary. It led to a deeply flawed economic compromise.
How so?
Well, the planters, they needed to get cash crops like cotton back in the ground. If they didn't, they risked losing their land to taxes or mounting debts.
Okay.
And the freed people, they needed housing, they needed food immediately, and they needed a way to earn a living that wasn't, a direct return to slavery under a different name.
So the system that emerged from this, tragically, you said, was sharecropping.
Sharecropping. Yeah.
So you describe how it was supposed to work. What was the theory behind it?
Well, theoretically, it looked like a step toward autonomy compared to the gang labor system under slavery.
How?
Instead of working in large gangs under an overseer's whip, a freed family would make a contract to work a specific plot of the plantation land, say 30 acres. They'd use their own family labor to cultivate it. Then, at harvest time, they would receive a share, a percentage, of the crop they produced. Often it was half 50-50 split with the landowner. Or maybe the family got 2/3 if they could provide their own mule and tools, which most couldn't initially.
So it offered a little more control over their daily work.
A limited degree, yes.
Yeah.
Control over their daily labor rhythm, working as a family unit. That was appealing compared to the direct supervision of slavery.
But the reality, as those WPA narratives really expose, was that the system had these built-in flaws that immediately turned it into a financial trap, a kind of debt peonage.
That's exactly right. And that's where we need to look closer. The flaw wasn't necessarily in the idea of splitting the crop itself. It was in the financing structure that propped the whole system up.
The financing, how did that work?
Okay, think about it. To work that land, to plant the first seed in the spring, and then to survive until the harvest months later. The sharecropper needed basic supplies right away. Seeds, fertilizer, maybe a plow, basic tools, and crucially, food and clothing for their family to live on until the crop came in.
Okay, where did they get those things? They had no money.
Exactly. The landowner, or sometimes a local merchant often connected to landowner, provided these necessities on credit. They furnished the supplies.
Furnishing. Okay, sounds helpful, but I sense a catch.
A huge catch, the cost of that furnishing.
High interest rates.
Extremely high. Predatory, really. Interest rates could range anywhere from 25% to 50%, sometimes even higher, and it compounded quickly.
Yeah.
But the real structural trap, the thing that locked people in, was cemented by state laws. Specifically, the cropland laws.
Cropland laws. Okay, let's focus on that term. What is a lien, and how did these laws guarantee dependency?
Okay, so a lien is basically a legal claim against someone's property that's used as collateral for a debt.
Got it.
The cropland laws passed across the South effectively said that any debt a sharecropper accrued for that furnishing the seeds, the food, etc., was legally secured by the future crop itself, before it was even harvested.
So the crop belonged to the lender until the debt was paid.
Precisely. The sharecropper could not legally sell any part of their harvested crop, not even their supposed share, until that furnishing debt, plus the massive interest, was fully paid off to the landowner or merchant.
Wow.
But because the interest was so high and the prices for supplies were often inflated, the debt frequently rolled over from one year to the next.
Which means the landowner or the merchant had complete financial control over the sharecropper's future earnings.
Absolute control. Come settlement day at the end of the harvest, the landowner would tally up the value of the sharecropper's half of the cotton or tobacco. But the very first thing deducted before the laborer saw a single dime was the cost of the supplies, plus that exorbitant interest.
And the accounting was fair.
Notoriously opaque. The books were almost always kept solely by the landowner or the merchant, who were often the same person or related. There was widespread cheating, illiterate farmers were easily defrauded, it was ripe for abuse.
So, time and again, people ended the year actually owing the landowner money, even after a full year's work.
Very often, they ended the year deeper in debt than when they started.
And if the account showed you still owed money, the cropland laws meant
They meant you were legally bound to stay on that land and work off that debt the following year. You couldn't legally leave to find a better arrangement elsewhere. It effectively negated the freedom of movement that emancipation was supposed to guarantee.
So this was, as you put it earlier, not slavery, but was far from economic freedom.
It was a brutally effective substitution of economic control for the physical control of slavery. It ensured the planter kept access to a dependent, cheap labor force, allowing families like the DeBows to keep their land productive without paying fair wages.
And at the same time, it prevented the freed population from accumulating any capital.
Exactly. No capital meant no ability to buy their own land, which was the only real path to genuine economic independence. This system locked the vast majority of black Southerners into a cycle of debt and poverty for generations.
It's a really stark example of how laws, legal maneuvering, can be used to maintain an existing power structure even after the foundation seems to have shifted.
A textbook case, unfortunately.
Now, this economic struggle, this debt trap, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was running side by side with an absolutely radical political revolution, especially in South Carolina.
Yes, simultaneously.
Let's move to that now, Section 4. Just how revolutionary was the political transformation during Reconstruction, and what made it even possible?
It was genuinely, profoundly revolutionary, unprecedented in American history up to that point, especially in a state like South Carolina.
And what allowed it?
It was made possible primarily by two things: the physical presence of federal troops enforcing the law, and the constitutional changes happening at the federal level.
Yeah.
Specifically, the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th Amendment, prohibiting denial of the vote based on race.
And South Carolina was unique.
In a way, yes. Because South Carolina had a black majority population, these changes meant it became the crucible, the real testing ground for this political transformation.
So what did this actually look like on the ground? What changed?
It meant that African American men didn't just get the right to vote. They exercised it, and they ran for and held public office at all levels.
All levels, like local, state.
Local, county, state legislature, even statewide offices. Think about the scale of this. South Carolina's 1868 Constitutional Convention, the body that wrote the state's new, more democratic constitution, it had an African-American majority among its delegates.
A black majority writing the state constitution.
Yes. And for much of the Reconstruction period, the majority of the members in the state House of Representatives were black. African Americans served as lieutenant governors, state treasurers, even as justices on the state Supreme Court.
That's just a seismic shift from zero political representation, zero rights, to, in some cases, majority rule in legislative bodies within a few years.
Seismic is the right word. A true revolution in political power.
And what were their political priorities once they had this power? What did they try to achieve?
Their priorities were exactly the kind of structural reforms needed to overcome the economic and social traps we were just talking about. They weren't just symbolic figures.
Like what specifically?
They worked tirelessly to establish a statewide public school system, something that barely existed for anyone, let alone black children, in the South before the war. They wanted schools open to all children, regardless of race.
Okay.
They fought for more equitable tax codes, trying to shift the burden slightly off small farmers and onto large landowners. And they attempted to reform the very debt laws, like the crop land system, that were trapping so many people. They were actively trying to legislate a free, more democratic society into existence out of the ruins of a slave state.
How was this exercise of power, this political empowerment, how was it perceived by the white planter class, the former Confederates?
It was viewed as an absolute existential crisis, an intolerable inversion of what they considered the natural God-given order of things. White South Carolinians, who just years before held absolute power, were now seeing their former slaves casting ballots, writing laws that affected them, serving on juries, judging white defendants. It was unthinkable. And this political empowerment was met with intense, highly organized, sophisticated, and increasingly violent resistance.
Okay, let's talk about that resistance. It wasn't just like grumbling or trying to win elections fairly, was it?
Oh, far, far from it. The resistance was explicitly paramilitary. It was domestic terrorism, plain and simple. While the Ku Klux Klan certainly operated in South Carolina, other groups became even more prominent instruments of this counter-revolution. Groups like the Red Shirts and numerous local rifle clubs.
Red shirts and rifle clubs, and their goal.
Their goal was twofold: regain total economic control and regain total political control. Undo Reconstruction by force.
And how did they use violence to achieve that?
They systematically targeted anyone who represented Black advancement or the Republican Party, which was the party supporting Reconstruction.
Who specifically?
African-American political leaders, obviously. Black men who were organizing voters. White and Black teachers in the new schools. Ministers whose churches served as community centers. Anyone advocating for Black rights or voting Republican was a target.
And the tactics.
Outright murder and assassination. Nighttime raids on homes and communities. The KKK specialized in this. Burning churches and schools, the very centers of Black organization and progress. And widespread public intimidation, especially around elections.
How did they intimidate voters?
They would parade armed through Black communities. They'd show up armed at polling places. They'd threaten violence or economic retaliation like eviction or firing against anyone who dared to vote Republican. They made sure that in many key districts, casting a free ballot was functionally impossible, or at least life-threatening.
So this was a deliberate, organized campaign of terror designed specifically to negate the constitutional rights that had just been granted by the federal government.
Absolutely deliberate. The explicit aim was disenfranchisement, to violently suppress and eliminate the Black vote, thereby allowing the white Democratic Party, the party of the old planter class, to regain political control of the state.
So it was a combination.
It was a pincer movement, really. Economic coercion through the crop lien system on one side, and physical terror through the Klan and rifle clubs on the other. And it was brutally effective in undermining and eventually dismantling the political gains of Reconstruction, even before the federal troops officially pulled out.
Okay, so against this incredibly turbulent backdrop, financial ruin for the old guard, radical political change met by this violent counter-revolution, we need to return to the families like the DuBois, the broader white elite. Section 5 asks, how did they adapt? How did these once powerful, now often bankrupt families manage to hold on, or at least lay the groundwork for their future recovery?
That's a really important question. And the key, for those who managed it, was holding on to the physical land itself.
The land?
Yes. While many poorer white farmers, and even some smaller planters, lost their land entirely due to debt or taxes in the chaos after the war, several of the larger, more established planter families, like some branches of the DuBois family, managed to retain their vast acreage.
How? If they were bankrupt.
Often through complex legal maneuvers, leveraging pre-war debts, maybe calling on connections they had in the North, or striking deals with creditors. It wasn't easy, but some succeeded in holding on to the core land holdings.
And that distinction, holding the land but having no cash, that's what we mean by land poor, right?
Exactly. That's the definition of land poor. They possessed this enormous physical asset, the land, but they lacked the capital, the liquidity, needed to pay taxes easily, invest in new farming equipment, or hire a large labor force with actual cash wages.
But that land was still crucial.
It was their anchor. It provided the collateral they might eventually use to get bank loans when credit loosened up. And crucially, it was the foundation upon which they could impose the sharecropping system. It gave them the leverage to secure labor access, even without paying real wages up front.
So their economic adaptation was really about maintaining their geographic and structural base, the plantation land, even if the financial mechanism running it had to change to sharecropping.
That was a major part of it, yes. But recovery wasn't just about economics. It also required a profound psychological and cultural adaptation. They needed to redefine their identity in the face of utter defeat.
How do you mean?
Well, they needed a narrative, a story they could tell themselves and the world that could somehow transform military defeat into a kind of moral victory and financial ruin into honorable suffering.
Yeah.
They needed to make sense of it all in a way that preserved their sense of honor and status.
And this is where the lost cause narrative comes in.
Precisely. The lost cause narrative became absolutely essential. It wasn't just a way for individuals to process grief. It was a powerful cultural tool used consciously for political and social purposes for control.
How did this narrative actually function, especially in those years right after the war? How did it get built?
We can actually trace its development quite clearly by looking at public sources
Hmm.
from the time, things like newspaper articles, dedication speeches for Confederate monuments, which started going up surprisingly early, and especially post-war obituaries.
Obituaries.
Yes, they're fascinating windows into public memory management. Let's use Julius Edward Dubos's obituary as an example, as mentioned in our sources. These weren't just simple death notices. They were carefully crafted narratives designed to shape how the deceased, and by extension, their cause, was remembered.
And what was the key element, the deliberate omission in these lost cause accounts?
Slavery. Overwhelmingly, the sources confirm that the lost cause narrative meticulously, surgically removed slavery, the actual central cause of secession and the war, from the official public memory. Race, the brutal economics of forced labor, the system they fought to preserve. Erased.
So if they didn't fight for slavery according to this new narrative, what did they fight for?
They fought for abstract principles. Honor, states' rights, usually vaguely defined, defending their homes and Southern identity, and above all, for gallant sacrifice against overwhelming odds.
Ah, the heroic defeat.
Exactly. They actively framed the Confederate soldier not as someone fighting to maintain human bondage, but as a tragic hero, a man of unwavering courage and principle who fought bravely for a noble, romantic, if ultimately doomed, cause.
And this reframing was crucial for their psychological healing.
Absolutely crucial. It allowed the defeated generation and their children to honor their dead fathers and brothers, to venerate the veterans living among them, without ever having to confront the fundamental moral and economic wrongness of the system they had fought and died to uphold. It salved the wound of defeat.
It also sounds like a pretty effective tool for maintaining the pre-war racial hierarchy in the post-war world, even if they couldn't control the ballot box everywhere just yet.
An incredibly effective tool. By claiming moral superiority, noble sacrifice, and a unique Southern identity forged in righteous struggle, they solidified the cultural unity of the white South. It drew a clear line against the perceived threat of black political power and Northern interference.
So the lost cause wasn't just misty-eyed nostalgia.
Not at all. It was the ideological fuel for the counter-revolutionary violence we talked about. It provided the justification for overthrowing Reconstruction governments, and later for instituting Jim Crow segregation. It was a cultural rallying cry that provided cohesion during a time of immense social and political fragmentation, and it allowed them to ultimately regain control by declaring their cultural and racial dominance as something timeless and immutable, regardless of the war's outcome.
Okay, so as we try to synthesize this whole period, it's clear Reconstruction was incredibly brief, wasn't it?
Remarkably brief, given the scale of change it attempted.
Brief, revolutionary, and just deeply complex, almost contradictory at times. It tried to fundamentally remake the American South.
It really was an incredible radical experiment in enforced top-down democratization and societal restructuring. But at the end of the day, we have to conclude that Reconstruction ultimately failed in its primary goal,
Which was?
which was to build a new, genuinely equal biracial society on the ashes of slavery. That attempt failed.
And the main reasons for that failure.
The primary forces driving that failure were, first, as we discussed, the successful and incredibly violent counter-revolution waged by white supremacist paramilitary groups. They simply would not accept black equality.
Okay.
Second, the waning political will in the North. The Northern public and government grew tired of the expense and difficulty of military occupation and enforcing black rights, leading to political compromises and the gradual withdrawal of federal troops.
And third.
And third, the successful implementation of those economic systems of control, primarily the crop-lien and sharecropping system, which effectively resubjugated black labor economically, even without formal slavery.
And that failure, that collapse of Reconstruction's promise, led directly to what?
It led to the political compromises like the Bargain of 1877, the withdrawal of the last troops, the subsequent era of the Black Codes, redemption, and then formally the establishment of Jim Crow segregation across the South. That system would define Southern life and race relations for the next century.
A tragic outcome in many ways.
Yes. But, and this is really crucial, we cannot view Reconstruction as a complete failure. If the political goals of interracial democracy and the economic goals of widespread black land ownership were largely thwarted, we have to ask, where did the lasting, profound success of this period actually lie?
Okay, where do we find that enduring success if it wasn't in politics or economics in the long run?
The profound, lasting success of the Reconstruction period was achieved by African Americans themselves in the form of institutional building.
Ah, right.
In that incredibly brief window, maybe 10, 12 years of relative political possibility and some degree of federal protection, African American communities built the essential infrastructure of self-reliance and future struggle.
You mean the things we talked about earlier, the churches, the schools?
Exactly. They established those independent black churches, which became anchors of community life, providing leadership, spiritual sustenance, and that protected space for organization. They created networks of public and private schools, sometimes against fierce opposition, that began the vital work of education and literacy.
And families.
And they solidified those reunified, legally recognized family units. These institutions, church, school, family, formed the critical backbone of black life.
So they weren't just, places to go on Sunday or places for kids to learn reading. They were more fundamental than that.
Much more. They were the command structure, the mutual aid societies, the cultural repositories, the leadership incubators for the community.
I know that's the lasting legacy.
That is the necessary infrastructure of survival. These institutions, built brick by brick during the revolutionary moment of Reconstruction, are what sustained black communities through the brutal decades of Jim Crow that followed. They provided the continuity, the resilience, the leadership, and the hope needed to endure marginalization, disenfranchisement, and violence. That foundation proved to be the enduring, powerful, lasting legacy of the Jubilee.
That synthesis really brings us to a powerful final thought, doesn't it? Something for you, the listener, to really consider. Think about how those institutional structures, those fiercely independent churches, those schools founded against all odds, those legally established family networks, all built during the revolutionary yet ultimately flawed and violently overthrown era of Reconstruction, how they ultimately defined the long arc of the civil rights movement nearly a century later.
It's a direct lineage.
The organizational strength, the community leadership developed in those churches, the emphasis on education from those early schools, the moral foundation necessary to challenge segregation. So much of it was laid down in those short, intense, contested years right after the Civil War. That initial building phase provided the bedrock, the necessary endurance, and the vision for the struggles and eventual triumphs of the 20th century.
It's a critical piece of history, isn't it? It shows why the seeds of institutional power, even when planted in the middle of chaos and defeat, are often the ones that yield the most important fruit, sometimes decades or even generations later.
Absolutely. Well, join us next time as we continue to track this complicated narrative of South Carolina, and specifically the descendants of these planter families. We'll move forward into the late 19th and early 20th century.
And tell the story of a deposed descendant who achieved international fame, and in doing so, profoundly complicated the Southern narrative in a whole new way.
That's right. We'll be looking at the author of the novel Porgy, which became the basis for the famous opera Porgy and Bess DuBose Hayward.
It's a fascinating story. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the turbulent, transformative roots of modern America.
We'll see you next time.